The baby had stopped crying only because its mouth was too dry to keep screaming. And when the women stepped out of the rocks with their rifles lowered and their eyes fixed on the child, I knew this desert was done testing me and had decided instead to judge me. I'd been walking for 3 days with the sun burning the back of my neck raw, my horse dead somewhere behind me, my canteen empty, and my wife buried under stones I couldn't lift anymore. The child in my arms was light now, frighteningly light, and when the tallest of the women spoke in broken English and said they had milk and shade and life if I agreed to marry one of them, the world went very quiet, as if even God had leaned in to hear my answer. I had heard stories about the Apache, about raids and scalping and women who laughed while men died, but none of those stories prepared me for the calm certainty in her voice, or the way the others watched me like traders waiting to see if I would sign away my soul. I wanted to scream that my wife was still warm in the ground, that my mouth tasted of blood and dust and grief, that a man does not bargain over his child's life. But the baby made a sound like a cracked leaf, and my knees buckled before my pride did. They took us to their camp without tying my hands, which somehow felt worse. And when they pressed a bowl of warm goat's milk to my baby's lips, and I saw the child drink like it had remembered how to live, I understood the cruelty of hope. That night, while the wind dragged sand across the fire and the women spoke softly among themselves, I lay awake thinking about how marriage had once meant a church and a dress and a promise whispered under breath, and how now it meant survival under a sky that did not care who you loved first. At dawn, they brought me to a circle of women, 3 of them, each different as the desert itself, and told me I could choose, or they would choose for me, because choice, they said, was a kindness they were offering. The first had eyes like polished stone and scars along her arms. The second laughed too easily for a place like this, and the third was the tallest, the one who had spoken, her face unreadable as the horizon. I asked what would happen if I refused, and no one answered, but the baby slept in the shade behind them, full for the first time in days, and that was answer enough. I chose the tall one because she did not smile, because she did not look pleased or angry, because she looked like someone who would keep a promise, even if it hurt. They did not celebrate. They did not bind my hands or paint my face. They simply nodded, as if this had always been the shape of things, and told me her name was Nantan, and from that moment on, my life was no longer mine to explain. The days that followed were a blur of learning how to exist again, how to walk without collapsing, how to eat without crying, how to sleep while surrounded by people who could kill you faster than hunger ever could. Nantan did not touch me at first. She watched me, taught me words, showed me how to wrap the baby against my chest, how to find water where I saw only stones. At night I dreamed of my wife's face turning into dust, and in the mornings I woke to the sound of my child breathing, and I hated myself for being grateful. Weeks passed and the camp moved like a living thing, never staying long enough to be found, and I began to understand that marriage here was not about ownership but obligation, about being tied to a circle of survival rather than a single heart. When the soldiers came, everything changed. They came loud and fast, rifles flashing, shouting words that tasted like iron in my mouth. I watched men die who had fed my child, and women scream who had saved his life. I tried to run, to hide, to disappear into the rocks with Nantan and the baby, but she pushed me into a crevice and told me to stay silent no matter what I heard. I heard everything. When it was over, the camp was broken, scattered, and the survivors gathered like wounded animals. Nantan was bleeding from her side, and as I pressed cloth to the wound, she looked at me with something like surprise, as if she had not expected me to still be there. That night she touched me for the first time, not with desire but with urgency, as if reminding the world we were still alive. And I realized that the bargain I had made was no longer just about milk or shelter, but about standing in the middle of a war that did not care who you married. By the time winter came, I was no longer a guest. I hunted, I learned to ride again. I spoke enough of the language to understand. When my name was spoken with respect, instead of suspicion. The baby grew strong, laughing at the firelight, unaware that his life had been bought with a promise that could never be fully paid. One night, Nantan told me she had offered me marriage not out of kindness, but because her people believed. A child saved bound the man forever, and I asked if she regretted it. She looked at me for a long time and said regret was a luxury for those who survived easily. I thought of my wife, of the life that had been buried with her, and I wondered if I had betrayed her or honored her by keeping our child alive at any cost. When spring came, the soldiers returned, this time with scouts who knew the land, and we were forced to flee deeper into the mountains. Food grew scarce again, and fear returned like an old friend. One night as we hid in a canyon, Nantan told me that if we were caught, they would kill the men and take the women, and she asked me if I would run if I had the chance. I wanted to say yes, to imagine a clean escape back to a world with laws and names and gravestones. But when I looked at my child sleeping against her chest, his fingers tangled in her hair, I knew there was no world left that did not include this one. When the attack came, it was worse than before. Fire, smoke, screams echoing off stone. I fought beside people I would once have called enemies, and I killed a man in a blue coat, whose face I still see when I close my eyes. In the chaos, I lost Nantan. I found her later near the river, standing over a fallen soldier, blood on her hands that was not hers. She looked at me and said it was time. We could not run together, she said. The baby would live better with me among my people than with her among the dead. I refused, but she pushed the child into my arms and told me this was the last part of the bargain. I tried to argue, to promise I would come back, but she kissed the baby's forehead, and then mine, and ran into the trees before I could stop her. I escaped at dawn, carrying a child who would never remember the women who had saved him, who would grow up hearing stories that painted them as monsters or myths. Years later, in a town that smelled of coal and rain, my son asked me why his skin was darker than mine, why his first word had not been English, why I woke screaming some nights. I told him the truth in pieces, about a desert that judged men, about women who made impossible offers, about how life sometimes demands you say yes to things that will haunt you forever. I never married again, but I kept my promise every day I lived, and when I die, I know the desert will remember my answer, even if the world does not.